I found out my mother-in-law had hired a private investigator to follow me the same way most women discover their marriage is already over, by noticing the same gray sedan parked across the street 3 times in 1 week. The first time, I told myself it was nothing. A coincidence. The second time, I felt that strange little pull in my stomach, the one that whispers something is off before your mind is ready to admit it. By the third time, when I stepped out of the pharmacy with a paper bag in one hand and saw the same man pretending to study his phone from behind the wheel, I knew someone was watching me. What I didn't know yet was that my mother-in-law, Margaret Bennett, believed she was about to expose me as a liar. What she was really doing was handing me the first thread that would unravel her son. I didn't confront the man. I didn't call the police. I didn't even mention it to my husband. I simply walked to my car, set the bag on the passenger seat, and checked my rearview mirror as I pulled out of the parking lot. He waited 6 seconds before following. That was when the cold settled in. Not fear exactly, but clarity. People don't spend money to watch you unless they're already hoping to find something. Ethan had been distant for months, but in the polished, respectable way that makes a woman doubt her own instincts. He still kissed my cheek before work. Still asked if I wanted coffee on Sunday mornings. Still smiled across the dinner table at his mother's house while Margaret served roast chicken on her wedding china and asked me questions that sounded harmless until you noticed how carefully they were aimed. "Busy week, Claire?" she'd ask, passing the green beans. "Still going downtown so often?" Or, "I heard your office changed its Friday hours. Funny how late you got home." She never raised her voice. Margaret didn't need to. She was the kind of woman who could make a room feel smaller with a single lifted eyebrow. Tall, silver-haired, always pressed and polished, she had spent 32 years mastering the art of saying cruel things in a tone gentle enough to deny later. And Ethan, my sweet, reasonable, conflict-avoiding Ethan, had learned from the best. 2 nights before I noticed the sedan outside the pharmacy, we'd been at Margaret's for Sunday dinner. Her house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac in Westchester, all white columns and trimmed hedges, the kind of place that looked warm from the outside and felt like a courtroom once you stepped in. I was clearing plates when Margaret touched my wrist lightly and said, "You seem distracted lately, dear." Secrets have a way of showing on a woman's face. She smiled when she said it. Ethan looked down at his wine glass. That was the moment I should have understood what was coming. But I was still trying to be the good wife. The patient wife. The one who believed tension could be solved with kindness and enough careful silence. The next morning, I parked outside a small brick office building on Lexington Avenue and waited until the gray sedan rolled in 2 spaces behind me. I watched the driver step out, mid-40s, navy jacket, sensible shoes, the kind of face designed to be forgotten. He didn't see me notice him. He thought he was early. He thought I was nervous. He had no idea I was about to walk into the one meeting that could destroy the story Margaret had built about me. And if he followed me through that door, he wasn't going to catch a cheating wife. He was going to help me prove that the only person truly lying in the Bennett family was the man I'd married. The elevator smelled faintly of lemon polish and old carpet as I rode up to the 4th floor, my hands folded neatly over my purse so they would not betray the tremor in my fingers. The office suite was tucked between a dental practice and a tax attorney, with frosted glass on the door that read Harper and Sloan Forensic Accounting in small black letters. Anyone watching me from the parking lot would have seen a woman in a cream wool coat walking into a quiet professional building on a Monday morning. Anyone determined to invent a scandal would have thought they had just captured the first piece of it. That was the problem with suspicion. It never looked for truth. It looked for shapes that matched whatever lie it had already decided to believe. Inside, the receptionist offered me coffee and asked me to have a seat. I declined with a polite smile and lowered myself into a leather chair by the window, careful, measured, composed. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, all soft brown hair pinned neatly at the nape of my neck, pearl earrings Ethan had given me on our 2nd anniversary, and the face of a woman who still looked more hopeful than she should have. I hated that most of all. I hated that even after months of sideways comments, missed explanations, and the growing distance in my own marriage, some part of me still believed there had to be a reasonable answer. There always is, people say, but there is not always an innocent one. When Mr. Sloan came out to greet me, he was exactly the kind of man a private investigator would love to photograph beside a married woman. Late 50s, trim gray suit, handsome in that reserved New England way, wedding band visible as he held the conference room door open for me. He spoke quietly, professionally, and slid a folder across the polished table with the kind of care usually reserved for medical results. In a way, that is what it was. A diagnosis. Not of infidelity, not of betrayal from me, but of numbers that did not add up, statements that did not match, and a pattern that was beginning to look far too deliberate to dismiss. 3 weeks earlier, I had noticed a transfer from our joint account that I did not recognize. $1,200. Small enough to ignore if you were not paying attention. Small enough to explain away with a shrug and a distracted husband saying he must have forgotten to mention a contractor deposit or a client dinner reimbursement. Then there was another one. Then another. Different amounts. Different dates. Each one sent through a personal account Ethan had once sworn he only used for old college expenses and occasional gifts. I had not wanted to believe what I was seeing, so I had done what careful women do when they are trying not to accuse too soon. I had gathered facts. Quietly, I had copied statements, checked dates, and when the numbers kept drifting farther from the man I thought I knew, I made the appointment. Mr. Sloan opened the folder and turned it toward me. A clean spreadsheet. Highlighted entries. A separate credit card I did not know existed. Payments routed through a limited liability company that sounded legitimate until you noticed. It had no website, no listed employees, and a mailing address tied to a private mailbox in White Plains. He tapped one line gently with his pen. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, his voice careful. "If your husband told someone you were hiding money, he may have done that to keep anyone from asking where this money was actually going." I looked down at the page and felt something in me go still. Not broken, not shattered. Still, because stillness is what happens when confusion finally runs out of room. Outside the conference room window, I caught a flash of navy through the frosted glass near the hallway entrance. A man pretending to read a brochure on the wall. Waiting. Watching. Taking notes for Margaret, no doubt. Let him. Let her have her photographs. Let her build her little case. Because by the time she decided to use them, I would have something far more dangerous than suspicion. I would have proof. By the time I walked back to my car, the sky had turned the pale silver of an early winter afternoon, and the wind carried that sharp New York bite that makes even expensive coats feel thinner than they are. I did not look directly at the gray sedan, but I did not need to. I could feel it there, parked 2 rows over like a patient accusation. I unlocked my car, settled behind the wheel, and set the folder from Harper and Sloan on the passenger seat with more care than I had used when I carried my wedding bouquet 6 years earlier. Funny what becomes sacred when a marriage starts to rot. Not rings. Not promises. Paper. Dates. Signatures. The things that still hold when people do not. I sat there for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at nothing, and let the truth settle into me piece by piece. Ethan had not just been moving money. He had been shaping a story. The separate account. The private mailbox. The strange transfers. And now Margaret's sudden interest in my schedule, my errands, my time downtown. None of it was random. None of it was maternal intuition. Someone had fed her a reason to distrust me, and I knew my husband well enough to understand how he worked when he wanted to avoid blame. Ethan never pushed hard. He nudged. He sighed. He let other people arrive at the ugly conclusion so he could keep his hands clean. On the drive home, I stopped at a red light on Mamaroneck Avenue and glanced in the rearview mirror. There he was again, the same man in the navy jacket, 2 cars back, eyes hidden behind the reflection of his windshield. He kept a respectable distance. Professional. Discreet. If I had been the kind of woman Margaret clearly thought I was, I might have panicked. I might have rushed home, confronted Ethan, demanded explanations in a storm of tears and broken trust. But panic is expensive, and I had already learned that the Bennett family loved to charge women for emotional reactions. So I did what I had done for months. I stayed calm. I drove home. I parked in our driveway in Scarsdale, with the maple tree out front stripped nearly bare and the porch lights still on from the timer Ethan had set last spring. The house looked exactly the way a good life is supposed to look in the suburbs. Clean stone walkway. 2-car garage. Holiday wreath not yet hung, but waiting in the mudroom. The kind of place people pass and assume safety lives inside. I let myself in, set my purse on the entry table, and listened. Silence. Ethan would not be home for another hour. I walked straight to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood at the island while the refrigerator hummed softly behind me. That kitchen had once been my favorite room in the house. Sunday pancakes, Christmas cookies, late-night wine, and whispered plans for a baby we had almost started trying for last summer. Now it felt like a stage where I had been performing normal for an audience that had already left. I opened the folder again and spread the pages across the granite countertop. Transfer dates, account numbers, a list of charges tied to the hidden credit card, hotel dining, gas stations in Connecticut, monthly electronic payments to the mailbox-linked company. Not enough to scream affair. Not yet. But enough to say there was another life running parallel to the one he showed me. My phone buzzed against the counter, and I flinched before I saw his name. Ethan. I let it ring twice before answering, just enough to sound casual, not cold. Hey, I said, smoothing my voice into something warm. Hey, you home? He asked. In the background, I heard office noise, a printer maybe, the low murmur of men who wear blue suits and believe spreadsheets make them honest. Just got in, I said. How was your day? There was the smallest pause, barely a beat. But once you know a lie is possible, you start hearing the silence that builds around it. Long, he said lightly. Meetings all afternoon. I might be late. Mom invited us to dinner on Thursday, by the way. Of course she had. My fingers rested on the paper trail of his secrets while he offered me his mother's table like nothing was wrong. I smiled into the empty kitchen where no one could see me. Thursday sounds perfect, I said. And for the first time in months, I meant it. Thursday arrived dressed like a performance. The kind of evening that looked harmless from the outside and carried all the tension of a courtroom under the surface. By 5:30, the sky had already gone dark, and the first cold rain of the season ticked softly against the windshield as Ethan drove us to Margaret's house. He had one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the center console, close enough to suggest familiarity, but not quite touching mine. He used to hold my hand at red lights. He used to reach for me without thinking. That is how marriages end sometimes. Not with shouting, but with tiny absences repeated so often they become the architecture of the room. I wore a navy cashmere sweater, pearl studs, and the expression of a woman who had decided to stop begging reality to be kinder than it was. In my handbag, tucked inside a plain manila folder between a lipstick case and a packet of tissues, were copies of the account statements Mr. Sloan had prepared for me, along with printouts I had made the night before while Ethan showered upstairs and hummed like a man with nothing to hide. Margaret opened the door before we even rang the bell. She always did that, as if she had been standing just inside waiting for the exact moment we arrived. There you are, she said, stepping back with a smile so polished it could have belonged to a television host. I was beginning to think the rain had scared you off. Her eyes landed on me for half a second too long. Measuring. Searching. I smiled back and kissed her cheek. Nothing scares me off that easily. If the line unsettled her, she hit it well. The dining room glowed with amber light from the chandelier, every place setting already arranged with military precision. White linen napkins folded into neat rectangles. Water glasses aligned exactly 1 inch from the edge of the table. Pot roast in the center, carrots glazed with honey, rosemary potatoes in a porcelain bowl Margaret only used when she wanted dinner to feel like a statement. She believed presentation could force order onto any mess. I used to admire that about her. Now I understood it for what it was. Control in a prettier dress. Ethan settled into his usual seat to Margaret's right. I sat across from him, where I could see both of them without turning my head. That mattered more than it should have. People reveal themselves in the seconds they think no one is watching. The first 10 minutes passed in the usual ritual of suburban civility. Weather, traffic on the Hutchinson, a neighbor's kitchen renovation. Margaret asked whether my office was still keeping such unusual hours, and I answered with a pleasant little laugh, saying year-end reporting always made things unpredictable. Ethan carved the pot roast and passed my plate without meeting my eyes. His cufflinks caught the light when he moved. Silver, engraved, a gift from his mother on our wedding day. Family heirlooms, she had called them. A symbol of belonging. I remembered thinking then that I was lucky to be welcomed into a family with traditions. I had not yet learned that some families use tradition the way other people use locks. Midway through dinner, Margaret set down her fork and dabbed her mouth with her napkin. Small movement. Deliberate. The kind of pause that tells you the real meal is about to begin. Claire, she said softly, I hope you will forgive me for asking something a little awkward. Ethan shifted almost imperceptibly. Not surprise. Readiness. He already knew. Of course he did. I set down my glass and folded my hands in my lap. That depends, I said. How awkward are we talking? Margaret smiled, but there was no warmth in it now. Only this. If there is something going on in your life that Ethan deserves to know, I think. Now would be a good time to say it yourself. The room went very still. Even the rain seemed to hush against the windows. Ethan finally looked at me then, his face arranged into concern so believable I almost admired the effort. Almost. And in that moment, watching the two of them across the candlelight, I understood exactly what Thursday dinner had been meant to be. Not a family meal. Not an intervention. A trap set with china and silverware. The trouble for both of them was that they were not the only ones who had come prepared. Margaret let the silence stretch the way some women let pearls rest at the base of their throat, deliberately, as decoration and warning all at once. Then she reached to the empty chair beside the china cabinet where a slim black leather portfolio had been placed before dinner, almost casually, as if it belonged there. She drew it onto the table and opened it with neat, practiced fingers. I would have preferred not to do this, she said, which is what people say when they have been waiting all week to do exactly this. She slid a glossy photograph across the linen toward me. In it, I was stepping out of my car on Lexington Avenue, my coat belted at the waist, the office building behind me. Harper and Sloan Forensic Accounting. The sign was blurred, but the image was clear enough to suggest secrecy to anyone who wanted to see it. Margaret placed a second photo on top. Me entering the building. A third. Me sitting across from Robert Sloan through the conference room glass, his gray suit visible, his hand resting near a folder on the table between us. From the angle, it looked intimate if you were desperate enough to need it to. Would you like to explain these? She asked, her voice still low, still composed. Across from me, Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose and lowered his eyes as if the burden of my supposed betrayal was almost too painful to witness. If I had not loved him once, I might have missed how rehearsed it was. I looked down at the photographs, then lifted one between my fingers and studied it with mild interest. You hired someone to follow me, I said. Not a question. Margaret straightened. I did what any mother would do if she suspected. Her son was being deceived. There it was. Not concern. Ownership. Ethan did not belong to himself, or to our marriage. He belonged to the story she had built around him, the one where he was decent, dependable, and forever one wronged woman away from sainthood. I set the photo down carefully beside my plate. And what exactly do you think these prove? Margaret's eyes sharpened. That you have been meeting a man in secret. That you have been lying about where you go. That you have been hiding something from my son. Ethan finally spoke, quiet and wounded in the way he knew would sound most convincing. Claire, if there is something you need to tell me, I would rather hear it from you. I turned to him then, really looked at him. At the familiar slope of his shoulders beneath his navy sweater. At the face I had once watched in hospital waiting rooms when his father had surgery. At the mouth that had whispered forever into my hair on a beach in Cape Cod before we married. It is a strange thing to realize a person can keep all the features you loved and still become unrecognizable. You want honesty? I asked. Good. So do I. Margaret leaned back slightly, confident now, sensing what she thought was surrender. Then start talking, she said. Instead, I reached into my handbag and placed my own folder on the table. Plain manila. Unimpressive. Not nearly as dramatic as surveillance photos. That is the thing about real evidence. It rarely arrives dressed for attention. I opened it, slid out 3 stapled packets, and placed one in front of Margaret, one in front of Ethan, and kept one for myself. The rain tapped steadily against the windows, a soft, patient rhythm beneath the crackling fireplace in the next room. Since we are sharing private investigations, I said, I thought tonight might be a good time to discuss the account ending in 4721, the credit card under your name that I never knew existed, and the company in White Plains that has been receiving money from our joint funds for the last 6 months. Ethan did not move. Not at first. Then all at once, the color left his face so quickly it was almost elegant. Margaret looked down at the first page, frowned, and then looked up at her son with the first real uncertainty I had ever seen cross her features. Ethan, she said slowly, what is this? He opened his mouth, closed it, and for the first time since this little performance began, no one at that table was looking at me like I was the one who needed to explain. The sound that followed Margaret's question was not dramatic. No shattered glass. No raised voices. Just the quiet scrape of Ethan's fork slipping against the edge of his plate as his hand lost its steadiness. It was almost disappointing how ordinary the beginning of a collapse could look. Margaret picked up the first packet and adjusted it closer to the candlelight, her expression tightening line by line as she read. She was a woman who trusted documents more than people. Contracts, statements, titles, receipts. That was why she had believed surveillance photographs so easily. Paper felt safer than instinct. But now the same faith was turning against her. These transfers, she said slowly, her voice thinner than before, are from your joint account. Ethan cleared his throat. Mom, it is not what it looks like. That sentence, more than anything, confirmed it was exactly what it looked like. I sat back in my chair and folded my napkin beside my plate. The pot roast had gone cold. The candles had burned low enough to throw soft shadows over the table, and the rain outside had settled into a steady whisper against the windows. Everything in that room seemed quieter now, as if even the house understood the performance had ended and the real story was finally beginning. Margaret looked from the statements to the highlighted line items, then to the second page Mr. Sloan had prepared, the one showing the credit card linked to a mailing address in White Plains. Why do you have another credit card? She asked. Not to me. To him. Ethan rubbed a hand over his jaw, buying time. He had always done that when he was thinking, ever since I met him at 29 in a Midtown conference room, where he had charmed half the room with a budget presentation and then asked if I wanted coffee after. Back then, I thought the pause meant sincerity. Now I understood it for what it was. Editing. It was temporary, he said finally. I was handling something privately. I did not want to worry Claire until I had it under control. I let out the smallest breath of a laugh. Not because it was funny, because men like Ethan always reached for the same tired ladder when the ground gave way beneath them. Concern. Protection. Good intentions misunderstood. Margaret's brows drew together. Handling what exactly? He glanced at me then, and for the first time that night, I saw real fear in his eyes. Not fear of losing me. Fear of losing the version of himself he had sold so carefully to his mother. I can explain, he said. Please do, I replied. My voice came out calm, even warm. That seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. Because I have spent the last 3 weeks wondering why my husband was telling people I was being secretive while quietly moving money behind my back. Margaret's head turned sharply toward me. He told me you were acting strangely, she said, almost defensive now, as if she needed to justify the ugliness of what she had done. He said you were disappearing during the day, hiding calls, being evasive. I held her gaze. I was disappearing during the day because I was meeting a forensic accountant after I found money missing from our accounts. I was hiding calls because I did not want to accuse your son before I had facts. And I was evasive because someone in this family had already decided I was guilty before asking me a single honest question. The words landed harder than if I had shouted them. Margaret blinked. Once. Twice. Then she turned back to Ethan, and I watched something shift in her face that I had never seen before. Not softness. Not guilt. Recognition. The kind that comes when a woman realizes she has been used and hates herself for how eagerly she helped. Did you tell me she was seeing another man? Margaret asked quietly. Because you needed me to believe that before she found whatever this is? Ethan's silence answered before he did. In the next room, the grandfather clock in the hallway began to chime 7, each note slow and measured, like a judge entering the room. By the 4th chime, Margaret had set down the papers. By the 6th, she was no longer looking at me with suspicion. By the 7th, she was looking at her son the way women look at strangers who happened to be wearing a familiar face. Ethan had always believed he could survive anything if he stayed calm long enough. It was one of the first things I had admired about him, back when I mistook composure for character. Now, watching him sit there beneath his mother's chandelier with his face gone pale and his fingers pressed flat against the tablecloth, I finally understood the difference. Calm was not always honesty. Sometimes it was just rehearsal. He drew in a breath and looked first at Margaret, not me, which told me exactly who he still thought mattered most in that room. I was trying to protect both of you, he said. The line landed with all the grace of a dropped dish. Margaret did not flinch, but something in her posture hardened. Do not insult me, she said, and her voice had changed. It had lost that polished hostess warmth and settled into the colder register I imagined she used with bankers, lawyers, and men who disappointed her. Protect us from what? Ethan swallowed. It started as a short-term loan, a bridge payment. I had a client issue this summer, a deal that stalled, and I needed to cover a personal exposure before it affected the firm. I intended to put everything back before Claire ever noticed. I almost smiled at that. Not because it was absurd, though it was. Because men like Ethan always thought the problem was getting caught, never the choice itself. You stole from our joint account, I said quietly. Do not dress it up because your mother is listening. He looked at me then, frustration flashing through the fear. I did not steal from you. It was our money. Interesting, I said. Because when your mother thought I was hiding something, suddenly the marriage mattered very little. But when you move money in secret, now we are a team again. Margaret's gaze cut sharply between us. How much? She asked. Ethan hesitated. I reached for the second packet and slid it toward her before he could shape another softer version of the truth. $38,000 for $120 over 6 months, I said. That is what I have confirmed so far, not counting the credit card balance. Margaret's hand tightened on the paper. She had not raised a dishonest son in her mind. She had raised a successful one, a respectable one, a man who wore pressed shirts, sent flowers on birthdays, and never forgot to thank the valet. Respectability can hide a lot in America if the driveway is nice enough. And what is the company? She asked. Ethan's jaw clenched. It is not a company exactly. No, I said. It is a mailbox. I let the words settle before I added the part Mr. Sloan had only been able to confirm that afternoon. A mailbox used to collect payments linked to a furnished apartment in Stamford. Margaret's head snapped up. Ethan went completely still. That was the moment. Not when she learned about the money. Not when she saw the hidden card. The moment the lie stopped being financial and became personal. An apartment, she repeated, each syllable precise. In Connecticut. Ethan pushed back from the table, just an inch, as if distance could help him think. It is not what you think. Margaret let out one dry, humorless breath. Tonight has taught me that sentence means the opposite of whatever follows. I did not interrupt. I did not need to. The room was finally doing the work for me. The rain outside had deepened, streaking the dark windows in silver lines. The candles had burned low, and the dinner Margaret had prepared so carefully sat untouched now, forgotten between us like a prop from an earlier act. Ethan looked at me, then at his mother, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked small. I was not seeing anyone, he said. The apartment was for someone else. I tilted my head slightly. Then I said, this would be the perfect time for you to explain why your mother hired a private investigator to follow me while you were quietly paying rent for another woman 2 states away. For a moment, no one spoke. The fire in the next room crackled softly, the rain tapped against the windows, and the old grandfather clock in the hallway kept time like it had no idea a marriage was ending in the dining room. Ethan looked trapped now, but not in the way innocent people look when they are misunderstood. He looked cornered in the way liars do when they realize every exit leads through a version of the truth they cannot control. He pressed his palms flat against the table and finally said the one thing neither of us expected. It is for Lily. Margaret frowned immediately. Lily. Her voice held genuine confusion now, not performance, not accusation. I had heard the name only twice in 6 years of marriage, always in passing, always attached to a distant family story Ethan never seemed eager to revisit. His cousin, the daughter of his father's younger sister, who had moved south after a brutal divorce and mostly disappeared from holiday cards and Christmas calls. Ethan exhaled shakily. She came back in the spring. She did not want anyone to know. She asked me not to tell the family, especially not you. Margaret stared at him. Do not drag your cousin into this unless you are prepared to prove it. I reached slowly into my handbag and pulled out the final sheet Mr. Sloan had given me that afternoon, the one he had only been able to confirm after a rushed phone call and a cross-reference with the lease guarantor. I slid it across to Margaret. I asked for that too, I said, because I was tired of half-truths. Margaret read the page once, then again, more slowly. The lease listed a tenant name. Lily Carter. Monthly rent. Stamford address. Ethan Bennett listed as guarantor. A payment trail matching the transfers from our account. Margaret's mouth parted slightly, and for the first time all evening, the anger in her face gave way to something almost more unsettling. Shame. Why would she hide from me? She asked. But the question was not really for Ethan. It was for herself. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face and leaned back in his chair like the effort of keeping up appearances had finally exhausted him. Because she was embarrassed, he said. Because she left her husband last year with nothing. Because she found out he had open debt in her name. Because she was staying in a women's transitional housing program in New Haven, and I helped move her into something safer after she found work. She did not want the family gossip. She did not want pity. And she absolutely did not want you deciding what was best for her. Margaret flinched. Tiny, but unmistakable. I felt something cold and complicated move through me then, because the truth had not arrived in the shape I expected. It was not an affair, not another woman in the way Margaret had imagined, and not betrayal in the cheap, obvious sense Ethan had allowed us to believe. But it was still deception. It was still secrecy funded by money taken without my consent, wrapped in suspicion and handed to his mother so she would aim at me instead of asking him harder questions. So instead, I said, my voice very quiet, you let your mother think I was cheating. You let her hire a stranger to follow me. You let her photograph me, humiliate me, build a case against me in her own dining room, all to protect a secret you could have told me if you had trusted me enough to be your wife. Ethan looked at me with red-rimmed eyes, and I could see the truth of it written plainly now. He had not trusted me. Maybe he had wanted to protect Lily. Maybe he had been ashamed. Maybe he had been afraid I would say no to draining our shared savings for a hidden apartment and another life he was financing behind my back. But fear does not erase what a person chooses. Margaret lowered the lease agreement onto the table with hands that were no longer steady. The photograph she had laid out against me sat off to one side now, forgotten and ridiculous. Proof of nothing except how badly she had wanted to believe the wrong woman was lying. She looked at Ethan first, then at me, and when she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. I hired a private investigator to catch my daughter-in-law in a lie, she said, staring at the table as if it might answer for her. Then she lifted her eyes to meet mine, and there was no pride left in them. And all I did was prove how little I ever bothered to know the truth. Margaret sat very still after that. The kind of stillness that only comes when pride has finally run out of places to hide. The candles had burned down to short, glowing stubs, and the dinner she had prepared with such careful precision had become irrelevant, just cooling dishes and polished silver in a room that no longer knew what to do with itself. Ethan looked from his mother to me, searching for the version of the evening he could still salvage, but there was not one. Some nights do not end with forgiveness or screaming, or dramatic exits. Some nights simply remove the last illusion and leave everyone staring at what is left. I folded the papers back into my folder one page at a time, slow and deliberate, the same way I had once folded baby clothes into a drawer in the guest room when Ethan and I thought we might start trying by Christmas. Strange, the small domestic rituals that come back to haunt you. Margaret watched my hands, then looked at the surveillance photographs she had spread across the table like evidence in a trial. Her own evidence. Her own certainty. She reached out and gathered them into a stack, but she did not put them away. She just held them, thumb pressed to the glossy edges, as if she could feel the weight of what they had cost. Claire, she said finally, and my name sounded unfamiliar in her mouth, stripped of judgment, stripped of polish. I owe you an apology. Ethan straightened a little, maybe hoping that was enough, that a single apology from his mother might soften the rest of what had happened. He still did not understand. The private investigator was not the deepest wound. The money was not even the deepest wound. It was the choice. He had chosen to let me stand alone under suspicion while he hid behind his mother's distrust, because that was easier than telling me the truth and risking my anger. Easier than treating me like an equal. Easier than being honest. You do, I said. My voice was not sharp. That was what made it land. Margaret swallowed. I thought I was protecting my son. I looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who had built her life around certainty, around being the one who always knew best, the one who could read a room, spot a liar, keep a family in line. No, I said gently. You were protecting the version of him you preferred. That seemed to hit her harder than anything else I had said all evening. Ethan opened his mouth then, desperation finally outrunning caution. Claire, please. I should have told you. I know that. But Lily asked me not to, and I was trying to help her. I did not know how to explain the money once it started adding up. Mom got suspicious, and everything just, he made a helpless gesture with one hand, as if lies had simply happened to him. Everything just what? I asked. Spiral. He looked down. I never wanted this. I stood then, smoothing my sweater at the waist, not because I needed to, but because I wanted the movement, wanted the simple physical reminder that I still belonged to myself. That is the problem, Ethan, I said. You never wanted consequences. That is not the same thing as not wanting to hurt me. The room went silent again. The rain had eased outside, leaving only the occasional drip from the gutters. Somewhere upstairs, the heat clicked on in the old vents. Ordinary sounds. A completely ordinary house. That was what would stay with me later, I think. Not the accusation. Not the folder of photographs. Just the ordinary shape of the room where I finally understood that love cannot survive where trust is treated like optional paperwork. Margaret pushed back from the table slowly and rose to her feet. For the first time since I had known her, she looked older than elegant. Do not go like this, she said softly. It was not an order. It was not even really a request. Just a woman standing in the wreckage of her own certainty, realizing too late that control and wisdom are not the same thing. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair and slipped it on. You hired someone to prove I was lying, I said, looking at both of them now. What you proved instead is that I was the only person at this table still acting like a marriage meant honesty. Ethan stood as I turned toward the foyer, but I did not stop. I heard him say my name once, then again, more urgently, but urgency is not the same as truth either. I walked past the framed family photos in the hallway, past the polished console table with the silver bowl Margaret always filled with winter pine cones, and opened the front door to the cold, clean air outside. The rain had stopped. The driveway glistened under the porch light, and the night smelled like wet leaves and stone. Behind me, the house remained lit and warm and full of people who had mistaken suspicion for love. I stepped onto the walkway, closed the door quietly behind me, and for the first time in months, the silence felt like something I could trust.